Breguet. If there's a legacy brand that people like to complain about, it's Breguet. Most of the comments speak to how Swatch is mismanaging Breguet and how Breguet is completely forgotten compared to its contemporaries like Audemars Piguet, Vacheron, and Patek Philippe. How bad is it really with Breguet? And if it is as bad as everyone says, why is it the case? And what would it take to get Breguet to a better place? That's what we're going to talk about, so let's dive in. Breguet has been around since 1775. It's a French brand, not a Swiss one. Breguet is hugely respected, and designs, innovations, and techniques that Breguet pioneered are used today across the industry. They pioneered some of the very first attempts at self-winding mechanisms. They introduced the first keyless winding watch. Breguet hands are a thing. The first solution to shock protection, the parachute, was also them. There's the Breguet overcoil and a whole lot more. Make no mistake, they have had a significant impact on the watchmaking world. If you want a good read about them, I'd suggest the book by George Daniels. This one is good. I'm not going to recommend the other ones. Some of them are more tedious, but the George Daniels one is a good one. Today, they've got a couple of lines. The Marine is their, relatively speaking, more sports-orientated watch. They have the Type 20, which is their luxury pilot's watch in a classic pilot's watch design. The Classiques are the simple dress watches, and the Tradition watches are the complicated, often semi-skeletonized or exposed complication watches. Finally, they've got the Heritage line, which is their tonneau dress watches, which are a bit more fashion-forward. And then they've got the Reine de Naples, which is aimed squarely at women. The closest you get to an integrated sports watch is the Breguet Marine. I won't make personal judgments as to its qualities just yet, but I think it's safe to say that if you have a buyer that is considering a Nautilus and a Royal Oak and an Overseas and a Breguet Marine, the Marine is the watch that's getting picked the least amount of times. They have no divers, they have no simple sports chronographs, their watches are all very classical in their aesthetic. This is old school watchmaking and watch aesthetics. Movements are done in-house and the watches aren't, fully handmade as it were, but these watches definitely fall into the category of heavy craft with complex finishing techniques being used from, anything from in-house enameling to hand-turned guilloches, hand engraving. If you are in any doubt whatsoever, these are watchmakers that do know what they're doing. Why are they even viewed as being mismanaged? First of all, right now, no cool people wear Breguet. John Mayer, LeBron James, Mark Zuckerberg, they all go for AP, Patek, and Sean. Breguet rarely, if ever, gets exposure in those echelons of wealth. Among watch enthusiasts, this is very much a niche brand that appeals to a seasoned enthusiast that shies away from more contemporary brands. You are very much making a statement by buying a Breguet in the watch collector community. It's rare to see a Breguet owner, and you're likely, if you are one, really down the rabbit hole of watchmaking and technique and history. But there's zero cool factor to the brand. One of the best ways for me to know whether or not I'm doing a good job in terms of content is subscribers. So if you feel that I am making videos that are worthy of your time and videos that you enjoy watching, then please consider clicking the subscribe button because it is the best way for me to gauge whether or not I'm doing something that is worthy of your time. So click the button if you feel it warrants it. Thank you. A famous sports person wearing your watch can change the perception of your brand. Almost all brands lean into fame, celebrity, and sports. Rolex is Roger Federer, tennis, horse riding. AP is rappers and basketball players. Patek is tech billionaires and oil billionaires and wannabe billionaires. I Googled who famous wears a Breguet, and the results were Napoleon Bonaparte, King George, and Winston Churchill. For Patek, it was LeBron James and Jay-Z. Now, I think the first three were cooler, but in terms of contemporary popularity, there's about a 250-year difference as to what Google thinks is a Breguet wearer. Breguet lean into talk about technique, skill, and heritage. This isn't unique to them. Lange and Zollner do this too. But despite how technically skilled a lot of brands are, it's actually not that common for brands to lean heavily on that part of their brand. I've long held the personal view that technique is overrated as a key selling point in the high end. Technique translated into specifications is super important in the value space, but in the high end, I think it's super overrated. I was watching this video of TGV when he bought his Breguet, and there was this one scene where he was talking with the sales rep at the Breguet store. So as sales reps do, he was highlighting something he felt was important about the watch, and I don't remember the exact wording. I'll put it somewhere on the screen. But he basically said that on their watches, this component, which I don't remember which one it was exposed for the client to see, unlike other brands that didn't. And this, according to him, was because Breguet believed they are so much better at this one thing than those other brands. Something to that effect anyway. And it's likely true, but I do believe those kind of technicalities are lost on a lot of people. For most buyers, you just tell them it's handmade and it's really, really well done and they know their skills, and people are likely going to be happy about it. Tech nerdiness in this space doesn't really sell that well. Their designs are also super old-fashioned. For those of you that saw the Q&A video, there's a timestamp so you can skip this section because it's kind of a repeat of what I said back then. But for the rest of you, just keep going and you'll be up to date with everybody else. They use Roman numerals. Roman numerals often make a watch look old. Just check Patek or AP. Their usage of Roman numerals is super rare. They use soft, modern Helvetica style fonts. Breguet also goes heavy on coin edges and Clou de Paris. It's beautiful watchmaking, but it makes your watch sometimes at least look like something out of 1775. You're not going to find a carbon stamped dial on a Breguet like you do on a 6007G from Patek. You're not going to find any F. Pigeon steampunk, which is getting a little bit tired, but it's still more modern than what Breguet puts on the table. They, of course, use Breguet hands, which it's their thing. But if I were to order watch hands in order of how old-fashioned they look, Breguet hands are going to be right up there with cathedral hands. A funny detail that I learned from Tim Mosso, and I wasn't really aware of this, on some models, Breguet apparently avoids Côte de Genève because to them it's almost too modern a technique for those specific watches. So to them, Côte de Genève is too modern. It's also Swiss, which is another topic, but it was too modern for them. Their logo is also old-fashioned. If you check Burberry and AP and Patek and Louis Vuitton and a ton of other brands, most of them have in recent years gone through a brand transformation where they've gotten Helvetica. I mean, it's boring beyond all belief that all brands look the same and their logos look the same, but they've got a modern look nevertheless. Breguet, on the other hand, they've got cursive and swirly and tons of serif, and it's long in the tooth, comparatively speaking. They also don't lean into modern materials. It's gold, it's platinum, pretty much exclusively. You're not going to find any edgy ceramics. As for their designs, off-center and pocket watch-inspired layouts isn't necessarily something that means they can't be popular. And I'm going to give them a pass because I don't think necessarily it makes them old-looking. It does to some extent. But I mean, most people likely don't know that it's reminiscent of pocket watch designs. So that's not their biggest problem. As for the watches as a whole, so not just the design aesthetic, but the sort of catalog, the catalog just doesn't speak to modern customers. The Marine is just not a competitive alternative to any other high-end integrated sports watch. The Pilot Type 20 has potential and is a good-looking watch, but I think their previous CEO had the right idea. It's much better than their other offerings for them, but it's far from a contemporary pilot's watch design and is not addressing the segment of buyers that are being offered modernized Calatravas and Fume dial 1159s on textile style straps. The tradition watches are aimed at the real nerds. I get flack for this sometimes, but skeletonization and exposed movements are really an acquired taste. Even the richest people think twice before they go down that road. And I'd make, one of my signature bold statements and say that the only brand that has really made a successful business model out of putting exposed movements at their core is Richard Mille. But that's because there's this sport and high-tech connection that they've been able to create that makes it acceptable. It's not particularly mainstream, and the way they do it, so Breguet, is a lot different from how AP and others apply skeletonization. Finally, they've got some wristwatches, which are dress watches. They're fine, they're white, they're black, they're blue, and there's silver dials. I mean, you'll be hard-pressed to find anything trendy like a salmon or a green or, heaven forbid, a purple dial. This is conservative with a giant C. But are they really doing as badly as a lot of people say? Well, yes, but you have to remember what they've been through. Back in the 70s, where Patek saved themselves from the quartz crisis with, the Nautilus, Breguet did not have a compelling answer. In the 1980s, for all sorts of reasons, they got into financial problems and quality problems, and Breguet were basically on the verge of death until Swatch bought them in 1999. That's more or less 25 years ago, but considering how long it takes to come up with a new model, stabilize a brand, revamp it, and just get it into a place where it's not a walking disaster, that's not a particularly long time. If the lens is that they're not as popular as Patek, then yes, they are massively underperforming. But considering that they might have ceased to exist in the year 2000, then they're in a pretty stable place right now. Now, with that in mind, Morgan Stanley has shown them to be consistently dropping in the annual watch report, with them placing in 14th place in 2017 and 28th place in 2023. That's 14 places dropped over 6 years. On top of that, their implied retail price of their watches is well below that of Patek and AP and a whole lot of others. In a market where everybody else has consistently been able to convince people to pay more for the same watch, Breguet just hasn't. Now, Swatch Group say they're very happy with Breguet, but Lionel Marco was CEO at Breguet for 3 years and was removed last year. He's been demoted to Vice President of Operations at Blancpain. Instead, Swatch put in some guy called Gregory Kissling. Now, you can say what you want, but if you are a success as a CEO, your next job is not VP of Operations. Based on that alone, my read is that no, Lionel Marco didn't deliver, and Swatch did their usual musical chairs thing and replaced one dude with great hair with another dude with even better hair and hoped for a better result. Breguet is not where Swatch wants Breguet to be, despite them saying that they're happy. Otherwise, they wouldn't be switching out their CEOs. That's my read. Now, the question isn't really whether or not they could or should be better. They can, and they should. For me, it's more of a question of weighing the options and assessing the individual strengths and weaknesses of those options. And there really isn't a clear right answer. I mean, based on my assessments of their problems, they would need more modern designs, a better integrated sports watch, more celebrities, a more elite approach to marketing, a revamp of their brand visual identity, and they'd have to distance themselves from technique and oldness and everything that makes Breguet. That's the sort of logical conclusion if you take a one-to-one approaches to, my read on their problems. But in fairness, every single one of my arguments can be picked apart completely. So just take the question of modern designs. Do you really want Breguet to make a modern integrated sports bracelet watch? Do you really want to move yourself into a space that's hyper competitive and potentially also losing a little bit of steam? And even more fundamentally, are you capable of building an integrated sports watch that doesn't get the reception of the Cubitus? The same goes for the general modernization of their designs. Basically ditching this love for Roman numerals. Roman numerals, of course, is a simplification of a broader challenge, but the complexity of moving to a more modernized aesthetic while retaining brand continuity is massively difficult. If you go too far, it's no longer a Breguet. And if you don't go far enough, you get the reaction that you got with the Type 20, which is it's nice, but not good enough. It's a half measure and ultimately not impactful enough. Branding and celebrity is the same problem. For me, it boils down to this question of positioning. However you read it, Breguet is in a relative decline and perception-wise are not where they could or should be. But right now, they've created this classic technical legacy niche for themselves, and they've put good work into putting themselves into that place. The problem is they are almost the only ones in the niche, and it's not a compelling niche. There just aren't a lot of customers for it, but moving them into a space where AP, Patek, and Mozart are, and a lot of others, also feels wrong. Solving Breguet's problem from the position of we just have to do what the other brands that are thriving are doing seems wrong to me. What Breguet is right now is a function of a very deliberate strategy set forth by Swatch and management at Breguet. Everything I criticized in my little Monday morning quarterback armchair coach perspective is just picking at a strategy that I think at the time has made sense for them. I think Breguet saw in the early 2000s what was happening with Patek and AP, and they said to themselves, we can't compete with that. We have to speak to the real aficionado, the real nerd, and we're going to target the classic customer. And I think strategically it was the right decision at the time to stabilize the brand and focus on this niche and not to play to the basketballers, the Ed Sheerans, and the celebrity game. The problem has just been they overestimated the size of that niche in terms of customers. It's there. It's just not a niche that has 50,000 customers a year. And it kind of leads me to think that maybe Breguet should decline even more. Not with the end goal of shutting down, but with the end goal of becoming even more niche and even smaller. According to Morgan Stanley, they sell around 20,000 watches a year. They sold less in 2020, but the average implied retail price has dropped significantly over time. Specifically, for a relatively high-end brand, a drop in price is not what you want. They shouldn't be like Patek and AP, and they shouldn't be aiming for 50 or 100,000 watches. But maybe they should be aiming for 5,000 watches, or maybe even 500. Probably a little bit low, but you get my point. Maybe their niche is more like brands like Akrivia and Gruppel Force and Grönefeld. That closer to them rather than closer to AP and Patek. Making them even more niche with the goal of attracting the ultimate aficionados, but also letting the price creep up with increasingly complex and premium products. They could also combine all of this with throwing in a few more watches that don't have Roman numerals. But basically the approach is not to chase the hype train, but instead to embrace positive decline. It's never fun to sit with a product that has declining sales. I've worked in that kind of company, but it doesn't have to be the end of the company. It can be a rebirth of a smaller, more focused company with a much more loyal niche. Now, whether that's 500 or 5,000 or 10,000 or 15,000 watches, I do think there is a clientele for what Breguet is as it is. And they can innovate and they should innovate, but Breguet maybe needs to stay Breguet. And small isn't bad, and not everything has to be about hyperscaling. Personally, I'd like to be able to afford a Breguet. Also, I love the fact that a brand like Breguet exists. One that isn't about hype and celebrity and contemporary styling. But for them to continue to exist, they might need to be smaller and more expensive. Personally, I'd lose out as an individual who doesn't have the money to buy $50,000 or $100,000 watches, but maybe that is where Breguet needs to be. Those are my thoughts. What are your thoughts on Breguet and their future? Share your thoughts in the comments. Like, subscribe. Cheers.